It is my great pleasure. I'm Gabriele Roccella, PhD candidate at the University of Calgary. On behalf of the Classics, Religious Studies, Anthropology and Archaeology interdisciplinary group at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this talk, one of the first of our 2021 talks, and today we are very happy to have Dr. Chiara Fedriani from the University of Genova joining us for a talk titled Embodiment and Metaphor in Latin Semantics, Evidence from the Figurative Language of Emotions. Before we begin, I would like actually to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, where the University of Calgary and the City of Calgary is situated, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, as well as Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now, we were talking about this extraordinary opportunity that the pandemic has given us, actually, as one of the upsides to this difficult situation we're all living, because we have the great opportunity of actually hosting talk by Dr. Chiara Fedriani, who is assistant professor in general and historical linguistics at the University of Genova, Italy. She received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Pavia, where she carried out a synchronic and diachronic study of the constructions expressing feelings and emotion in Latin, now published as Experiential Constructions in Latin by Brill in 2014. Her research interests are in the area of historical linguistics with a focus on Latin syntax, semantics and pragmatics, and of cognitive linguistics. And without further ado, I leave the floor to her. She should be able to share her screen.
Yes, so I'll do it right away. Okay. Okay, I think I'm sharing now. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I hope you see it clearly. If not, please stop me so that I can see you. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to... Okay, so you see my slides without any other button or Zoom bar?
Yes, no,
right?
We see
okay, perfect.
Clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much, Gabriele, for your introduction, and thank you to the Craig Research Group for this wonderful invitation. I am very happy to be here with you today, although remotely, but this is a very nice opportunity to meet you and to share the results of an ongoing project at the University of Genoa. So I will be more than happy to receive your comments and ideas on the work I'll be presenting today. So today we'll talk about metaphor and embodiment in Latin semantics. I will show you that both metaphor and embodiment are fundamental cognitive processes at work in language and in thought. So metaphors arise from a general cognitive mechanism that is, as we will see in detail, interpreting one thing in terms of another. And as we will see, metaphors are pervasive, not to say ubiquitous. To make a very simple example, love is often conceptualized as a bond in Latin. So in these examples, we have clear instances of this mapping. Una è scatena cui nos allegato stenet, amor vitae. There is only one chain which binds us to life, and that is the love of life. Amoris profundi pedicis aeternis alligat, or mentem amore revincens, binding her heart with love, or amoris vinculum, the bond of love. This example instantiate the love is a bond metaphor, which has been described in detail by Kovacs, an important cognitive linguist, among many others, in relation to modern languages. See, for instance, these expressions, which are very common in English, and I think you have used probably hundreds of times, and which point to the very same mapping between the concept of love and the concept of bond. There is a close tie between them. She has an attachment to him. She tied me down to loverly rules, or the Italian expression sono molto legati. They have a real connection, again, with this idea of a bond. Literally, they are very tied to each other. So the cross-linguistic validity of this metaphor lies in the fact that we tend to be physically closer, in the literal sense of sharing the same space, to those people who are intimates, for example, friends, relatives, colleagues, than to those that are strangers. So in other words, this metaphor correlates with our experience in physical space, something we rely upon very often to interpret and categorize reality, as we will see. So in this talk, I will show some data on how Latin speakers made sense of their bodily experience to categorize and express some basic emotions. And the structure of the talk is as follows. I will start with some preliminary notions on conceptual metaphor theory and on embodiment, focusing on its application to classical languages. Then I will say a few words on a project I am currently developing at the University of Genova, and I turn to the data and the results of our research on the metaphorical conceptualization of love, hate, fear, and anger. And then I conclude with a case study on the anger is a hot fluid metaphor, which, in my view, sheds light on the complex relationship between embodiment, cognition, and culture. And then I close with some final remarks. So, to begin with, some words about conceptual metaphor theory. What are metaphors? Well, traditionally, from antiquity to the 80s of the last century, metaphor has been seen as a merely rhetoric phenomenon, a literary device to enhance ornateness of expressions. So in this view, only those talented writers could well manipulate metaphors, and it is hardly out of the question for us average people to use them. The crucial turning point changing this perspective in metaphor studies is Lakoff and Johnson's 1980 seminal work, Metaphors We Live By, which first recognized that metaphor is a fundamental cognitive operation of the mind, and that metaphors in language are the reflection of metaphor in thought. So this means that we actually understand, interpret, and categorize the world with metaphors, and do not just speak with them. So we think with metaphors, first of all. So metaphors are basic to our language and to our reasoning. Another crucial point made by Lakoff and Johnson is that the mind is embodied. This means that concepts are structured through our concrete sensory motor experience of the world that we inhabit. So how metaphors work? Well, metaphors arise from a general cognitive process, as I said in the intro, that is interpreting one thing in terms of another and establishing meaningful projections between organized domains of knowledge. And according to Pollack, 2014, this is basically due to a pervasive cognitive mechanism that the author calls an analogical instinct, which guides our reasoning and which helps us infer concepts from one domain and apply them to another. And research in the field has even shown that metaphorical thinking is so fast, so automatic, and so ubiquitous that basically it is unconscious for us. So we think metaphorically, but we are not fully aware of it. And some studies have revealed that 70% of our linguistic productions are of metaphorical quality. So to sum up, given the all-pervasive character of metaphorical thinking, metaphors in language are simply everywhere. And I will try to deepen this point with regard to Latin, but also with some observation on English. So, in conceptual metaphor theory, metaphors are understood as conventionalized conceptual images that presuppose an association via comparison between a source domain and a target domain. A source domain is generally a concrete and easily accessible concept that helps categorize and understand an abstract concept called target. The target is typically more complex to grasp. So if we consider the metaphor I've shown at the beginning, love, in that case, is the more abstract concept, which can be seen, for example, in Latin, but also in English and in Italian, in terms of a concrete entity we experience in ordinary life, such as a bond. Interestingly, the idea of an association of concepts belonging to different domains is already present in the ancient definition of metaphor. So, for example, for Aristoteles, metaphora destin onomatos allotrio epiphora. A metaphor is the application of a word that belongs to another thing. Or in Cicero, we find this interesting definition, verbis quae transferuntur et quasi alieno in loco collocantur. Words used metaphorically and placed in a connection not really belonging to them. So note the use of the verbs metaferein and transferre, which are basically the same verb, so to speak, which point to the idea of a transfer of meanings, which is described in terms of a concrete action, that of carrying something from a place to another place. So here, the verb metaferein and transferre encapsulate a metaphor themselves because they point to a physical transfer, which is here understood as a transfer between concepts from an original conceptual domain to an external one. This idea of an external domain is well expressed by onomatos allotriu e alieno in loco. These are different domains toward which original concepts are transferred. So, to summarize this brief introduction about metaphors, we have seen that metaphors are the product of our analogical thinking. They are conceptual structures and not mere linguistic expressions. And we speak metaphorically because we think metaphorically. Let us now turn to the other key concept of the talk, that is embodiment. So according to the embodiment hypothesis, and you find here the cover of a milestone book about it, Philosophy in the Flesh, again by Lakoff Johnson, 1999, our conceptual system is based on the body and the brain. So we typically interpret what is not physical in terms of what is physical, modeling abstract concepts after our bodily-based experience in terms, as Lakoff 1987 wrote, of physiological features, biological capacities, and our functioning in a physical environment. So to summarize with the words of Lakoff 1997, the structures used to put together our conceptual systems grow out of bodily experience and make sense in terms of it. So the core of our conceptual systems is directly grounded in perception, body movement, and experience of a physical and social nature. And let me clarify this point with an example. Let's take the metaphor affection is warmth, which is instantiated in English by expressions like the following. We have a warm relationship. She's warming up to her new brother-in-law. They gave me a warm welcome. And note that we also have the symmetrically opposite metaphor, dislike is cold. So expressions such as she was decidedly cold. Now, this is a highly embodied metaphor naturally arising from the correlation experienced in our childhood between the loving embrace of our parents and the comforting bodily warmth that typically accompanies it. So we have a direct link between a physical, a bodily perception and the context where we typically experience this perception, this feeling, that is, in this case, embrace, and embrace expresses love and affection. So this bodily-based experience is essentially universal, shared across different cultures and languages around the world. And this is why this metaphor arising from this experience is presumably universal too. And in conceptual metaphor theory, this type of metaphor is called primary metaphor. Another type of metaphor which clearly shows the connection between body and cognition is happy is up or good is up. Consider examples like, I'm feeling up today, my spirit rose, you're in high spirits, thinking about her always gives me a lift. Or the reverse schema, sad or bad is down, he's really low these days, for instance. So such metaphors are called orientational metaphors. They organize metaphorical concepts in terms associated with spatial orientations, such as, for example, up versus down, inside versus outside, central versus peripheral, and so on. So the up-down opposition I'm discussing here in this slide, for example, is motivated by the fact that since we have a head at the top of our bodies, opposed to feet at the bottom, our bodies are radically different at their top and at their bottom, and we have a clear, constant experience of this. This results in the human body being vertically conceptualized along functionally asymmetrical opposite poles in terms of an up versus down antithesis. In particular, the association of the concepts of up and good together depends on the fact that standing tall is typical of feeling good and energetic, thus evoking positive balance, whereas frowning is associated with illness and death, being linked to negative emotions. So in other words, when we lie horizontally, either we aren't feeling good, or we are dead, or we sleep. So we are not in rational control, for example. So the horizontal posture correlates with negative feelings, with negative values. Note that this spatially opposed association is documented also in Latin to evoke positive and negative concepts. So, for example, in Seneca we have non potest sapiens ex beato in miserum decidere. The wise man cannot fall from happiness to wretchedness. Or one can also concidere ex amplo statu, fall from a high position. So again, we have this vertically organized system of concepts. So drawing on these theoretical assumptions, we are currently applying this framework and these ideas working within a project entitled The Lexicon of Embodied Experience in Latin. The team is circumscribed, made up of myself, Dr. Irene De Felice, who works as a postdoc research fellow. Now we also have a visiting PhD student from the University of Edinburgh, Roberta Leotta, working with us. We also collaborate with William Short as an international research partner. He works at the University of Exeter, UK. And moreover, last year I taught a course at the Università Cattolica, I can say it in Italian, in Milan. And I involved a small group of very talented students in our project. They did an excellent job on the metaphorical conceptualization of hate and envy. And one of them, Elisa Migliaretti, is attending the talk today, I think. So the focus of the project is on the metaphorical actualization of embodiment as a biocultural foundation in the Roman world. So we are particularly concerned with emotions and try to answer research questions like the following. On which sensory motor bodily experiences did Latin emotion metaphors rely? Are any cultural specific mappings entrenched in Latin emotional metaphorical system? Are metaphors frequently found in modern Western languages, such as English, Italian, French, and so on, documented also in Latin texts? If not, why not? And which are shared and which are not? So the goal is to explore the embodied basis of Latin figurative emotion language from different perspectives, considering over 700 years of Latin, from the 3rd century BC to the 2nd century AD, but we are also expanding the scope of our research to late Latin, so including data until the 4th, 5th century AD. Our project has been inspired by recent advances in classical cognitive linguistics, a line of research which has flourished since the publication of a book entitled Embodiment in Latin Semantics, edited by William Short in 2016, and 2 more important books came out in 2019. I can give you the bibliographical references if you are interested, of course. So our analysis is corpus-based and drawn on the Antiquitas section of the Biblioteca Tiberiana Latina, which comprises over 1,140 works by nearly 600 authors spread over 5 centuries, as I said. So what have we done? Well, we have extracted from the corpus all occurrences of the main lexemes expressing the 4 basic emotions considered, for a total of more than 12,000 tokens. We have then examined each context and distinguished between literal and metaphorical uses. This was the first step. For instance, a case such as premetu ubisim nescio, I don't know where I am for fear, features a literal use of metu, which has been, this is a causal expression, of course, which has been counted but not analyzed further. By contrast, in Italicum impectus iniciam, I inject some fear into his heart. Fear is conceptualized metaphorically as a substance, a liquid substance, that can be injected into someone's body. So such contexts were counted and then further classified. It turned out that 30% of all attestations of the emotion terms considered were used metaphorically. We have then classified all of them according to the cognitive linguistic formula X is Y. For example, love is a bond. This giving rise to a set of 101 distinct metaphorical mappings. More specific questions arising at this point are: how were love and hate, anger and fear predominantly conceptualized by Roman speakers? In what do they differ? What is the type and degree of embodiment entrenched in their conceptualization? Are there any differences among the emotions considered? And if yes, what are these differences and how can we account for them? This chart represents the general results. That is, the most frequent metaphorical mappings emerged for the expression of each emotion: anger, fear, love, and hate. So as the chart shows, the most frequent metaphorical mappings that are documented in the Latin literature for the conceptualization of the 4 basic emotions under scrutiny are: an emotion is an opponent for the expression of anger. An emotion is a substance for the expression of fear. An emotion is a living being for the expression of love. And an emotion is an object for the expression of hate. So in what follows, I will describe and discuss in more detail these metaphors as suggest the possible account of the differences emerging from the four emotional domains. As I said at the beginning, I look forward to hearing your ideas and your comments and what you think about it, because this is an ongoing project, an ongoing research, and discussion is very welcome at this stage. So I really look forward to seeing what you think, if our ideas convince you or not. Okay, in particular, the metaphors preferably instantiated by the four emotions under scrutiny differ in terms of two main parameters, namely they differ according to the type of interaction with the experiencer's body and according to different degrees of involvement and affectiveness. For example, as the schema summarizes, objects are inanimate entities which are external to the human body and can only superficially interact with it. Example, I can take a bottle, I can move it, touch it, handle it, but my body is not substantially affected, altered, or changed by this bottle or by objects in general. A living being, in turn, can be more actively engaged with us, especially if it is an opponent violently attacking, shaking, beating us. A substance, in turn, is the most embodied entity of this set, since it can even enter our body and fill it up. So such discrepancies can tell us something about the way in which the ancient Roman speakers, writers, perceived, interpreted, and categorized anger, fear, love, and hate, and also the conceptual distance between them in the understanding of their emotional world. So let us first consider hate. Hate is preferably conceptualized in terms of a concrete object, and it can be handled accordingly in a variety of ways. For example, hate can be broken, odium iramque frequentissime frangat, it frequently breaks down hatred and anger. It can be moved, odium semper contemptumque tiberi prese ferens, so someone who carries in front of him his hatred. Hate can have tactile and visual properties, odium acerrimum, sharp hatred, odio obscuro, obscure hate, and can even have a taste, odium fuisse liusi nunc acerbissimum. Claudius hated Milo bitterly. So although all the emotions considered can be conceptualized as concrete objects, our corpus-based study shows that hate in particular has a neat predilection for this specific mapping, while love, anger, and fear oscillate between the 12–16% of realization as objects out of the total amount of their metaphorical uses. Hate is figuratively interpreted in this way in the 29% of cases. So a question thus arising at this point is, what is the motivation behind such a distribution? And in our view, there are essentially two reasons, both inherently connected to the peculiar nature of hate. Firstly, hate is a more psychological and less physiological emotion, one that does not clearly correlate with any physical symptom. So in other words, hate does not produce evident bodily reactions. This is probably why it is preferably conceived as an inanimate entity which is external to the human body and can only superficially interact with it. As we have seen, objects can be taken, possessed, for instance, but cannot enter our body typically and fill it up as substances do, and do not typically have significant impact on us. So generic objects, think of a book, a pen, a table, do not harm, alterate, or destroy living beings. Of course, more specific objects such as a knife or weapons or a bomb can, but I mean, the prototypical object we have in mind is not a weapon. And we have other metaphors involving weapons, which are which form another category, and I'm not taking them into account here. Secondly, hate is an intrinsically relational emotion, a sense of intense hostility which is perceived towards someone, in opposition with fear, anger, or happiness, for instance, that can be provoked by a wider range of stimuli. So this may explain why hate metaphors are significantly entrenched within a specific schema, that is the exchange schema, where participants transfer hate as object from one to another, to the other. This point is evident if we consider these examples, instantiating some metaphors such as hate is an object that is given to someone, odium dedit, taken from someone, odium susceptum sit, literally have taken hatred, or transferred among participants. Atiria collectum pelice transferred in generis socius odium, had now transferred her hatred from her Tyrian rival to those who shared her blood. So an object which can be passed from hand to hand, so to speak. Let us now turn to love. Love is often seen as a living being. First, as someone who comes and goes. For example, amor advenit, love arrived, or quantus in exiguo tempore fugit amor, how great a love has run away in such a little while. So this image of love as a moving entity which comes and goes points to a specific view of love as an ephemeral feeling which passes, basically. Another interesting image is love is a blind living being, which is a highly embodied metaphor since it reflects a conceptualization of love as causing a strong physical impairment by altering a vital function such as sight. So it is not difficult to understand the cognitive meaning attributed to blindness, considering that our physical ability to see is primarily aimed at controlling our actions. And from this important correlation, a very widespread metaphor emerges, which is understanding is seeing. Consider also the semantic extensions of verbs of vision in English, such as see or look. When you say, I see your point, this means I understand what you're saying, or yes, I see, or look, you're wrong. Here, look means consider. Okay, look in a cognitive is used with a cognitive sense. So there is a very strong link between vision and understanding in general. And the fact that love is often seen as someone who is blind is very interesting because it points to the idea that love causes loss of control and irrational behavior, in a sense. And the idea of the loss of control is a very salient component of the experience of love in the Roman world, which is found also in the metaphor love is insanity, which presupposes the experiencer's loss of control over passion, which can even lead to madness, to mental insanity. There is also another representation of love, which has in turn a positive implication, that is love is also seen as a winged living being whose realm is the sky. And this is interesting because this metaphor correlates with a very widespread metaphor in modern languages, which is being happy is being off the ground. So both the idea of love as a winged being and the idea of happy being off the ground, of course, are associated with the orientational metaphor I was talking some minutes ago, whereby high is usually associated to positive concepts, as we have seen. So in conclusion, love can bring happiness, but it's also seen as an ephemeral and highly irrational feeling, something that escapes our control altogether. Okay, let's now turn to anger. The metaphor, and we have seen in the mosaic chart before that here for anger, the most prominent metaphor is that of the opponent. Now, the metaphor, an emotion is an opponent, constitutes overall the most frequent macro schema emerging from our analysis, occurring 716 times in the Latin literature. It is attested not only for negative emotions, that is for anger, fear, and hate, but also for love. And this is hardly surprising since all kinds of emotions are difficult, if not impossible, to control. They arise involuntarily, elude rational thinking, and for this reason, they are often contrasted by us, by those who experience them. So the most frequent specific mapping documented in the literature is anger is an opponent in a battle that emerges when the emotion is conceived as a strong and combative enemy armed with weapons, armiferos furores, fury of army, who can be resisted, resistendum esse iracundie, one must resist to temper, and can even be defeated, iracundiam qui vincit ostem superat maximum, who quells his wrath overcomes the mightiest foe. In our view, the strong presence of metaphors related to the warfare may be explained by considering the effects that anger causes in those who experience it. So anger increases aggression, recklessness, it leads to violence, and in the battlefield, anger may even be considered as a useful and desirable quality because it fully displays its adaptive function, causing those psychological and physiological reactions that prepare the warrior to attack his opponent. So an angry warrior is stronger in a sense. So this is why the conceptualization of anger is so strictly related, in our view, to that of an opponent who, for example, can shake and aggressively agitate the experiencer per motus iracundia, literally shake by anger, can size and hold the experiencer, ira omnes rapit, ardor sized everyone, an opponent who can injure the experiencer, alium ira incubili suo confodit, alium ira intra sacra mensa iura percussit. So anger stabbed this one in his bed, struck down the other one. So there is a clear, evident link between anger and the violent enemy, a violent opponent. Let us now conclude with fear. So the metaphorical mapping involving the projection of emotions into generally liquid substances is documented in the 8 to 12% of cases for anger, love, and hate, with a frequency peak 27% in the domain of fear, in which it reveals itself as the most frequent metaphors. So the predilection exhibited by Latin speakers to think and talk about fear in terms of a substance pervading the experiencer's body is a clear example of how conceptual schemas can be grounded in bodily experiences. So in our opinion, the radical embodiment of fear basically rests on the fact that fear, terror, and horror are usually accompanied by clear somatic reactions. The most typical being drop in body temperature, shivering or stiffening of the limbs, pallor, and cold sweat. The Virgilian passage on this slide provides a piece of evidence for the bodily reactions associated with the psychological experience of horror and fear, horror formigine, especially that of freezing. So beyond the shaking of the limbs, membra quatit, Virgil mentions the perception of cold, frigidus, and the chilling of blood, gelidus sanguis, caused here in Aeneas by sight of a myrtle trickling blood, sign of Polydorus's metamorphosis. This passage lets us touch upon another relevant issues, namely that a number of fear words in Latin encode embodied metonymies at the level of etymology. So the polysemy of horror, which expresses both the bodily sensation of trembling and metonymically the emotional state of intense fear, frequently associated with it, for example, traces back to the Indo-European root meaning to be stiff. This suggesting a clear derivation of the abstract meaning of horror from the stiffness of the limb that can co-occur with dread. So these two concepts are very close. And other metonymies associated with fear at the level of etymology include pavor, from paveo, the stative verb of pavio, to hit, strike, and terror from terreo, tracing back to an Indo-European root meaning to shiver, tremble. So the physiologically based etymology mentioned here highlight the conceptual relevance of the somatic reactions of fear, whose lexical encapsulation gave rise to some recurrent semantic extensions. In our view, the physiological responses associated with fear had an impact on the way Latin speakers metaphorically embodied it as a concrete entity capable of tangible interaction with their own body, which mostly manifests itself in terms of a liquid substance pervading and imbuing the experiences, vitals, joints, and bones. In viscera horror it, cruel shudder pierced my vitals. Tacitus penetravit in artus horror, an unspoken dread penetrated in our joints. Or frigidus ad strictis qui regnat in ossibus horror, the sick dread which racks your shaking bones, and so on. So you see that basically fear enters the body and pervades it. So we have seen that metaphors, the structure, the romances, emotion concepts were pervasively rooted in their physical experience of embodied beings. And this explains why metaphorical understandings of the world we inhabit or our ancestor inhabited are very often shared across languages and cultures. But is everything so simple? In what follows, I broaden the scope of the discussion with a brief case study to reconstruct the historical development of the well-known anger is a hot fluid schema metaphor, which serves as a case study, as I said, to show how considerations of cultural factors can help us gain further understanding of the emergence and conventionalization of metaphorical embodied meanings. So very briefly, the anger is a hot fluid metaphor emerges from a metonymic conceptualization of anger in terms of its physical symptoms, such as an increase in bodily temperature and heart rate, a sense of internal pressure. So this is a very strongly bodily-based metaphor. And as such, it is generally recognized as having a universal status. So we can call it a primary metaphor. Recall the affection is warmth mapping we have discussed earlier today. Crucially, however, we've registered the striking absence of this metaphor in the Latin literature. To be precise, we found 2 instances of it, a surprisingly low frequency. This means that this metaphor, which is now an active metaphorical concept in many Indo-European languages, was not included among the common means Romance speakers had at their disposal to talk about this feeling. Our corpus-based analysis revealed that this metaphor is used solely by 2 authors, Lucretius and Seneca. This can hardly be taken as a mere coincidence, in my view, the more so because these 2 authors share a precise philosophical view of emotions. And here I will try to show that the cultural motivation behind the emergence of this metaphor in Latin rests precisely on the Epicurean and Stoic views of emotion. So, very briefly, in Epicureanism, as you probably know, the understanding of emotion is essentially based on the analysis of its phenomenology, which paves the way for the Epicurean therapeutic approach. So in short, according to the Epicurean theory, the soul is a combination of 4 elements: air, wind, heat, and a vague quarta natura, 4th element. And the relative proportion of the atoms in a person's soul directly influences his temperament. So Lucretius illustrates this theory in the Rerum Natura 3, pointing out that when the air is in a tranquil state, the heart is at peace and the facial expression is serene. By contrast, when we're hungry, the heat, calorille, that is in the soul, begins to boil over, effervescit in ira. So basically, those who are angry possess a greater quantity of heat. Therefore, the conceptualization of anger in terms of a hot fluid boiling in the body first appears in Latin as scientifically based on Epicurus' materialistic psychology, according to which a person's mental state is determined by the states of his atoms. This is a very important point. For Epicurus, and then for Lucretius, anger really is a concrete hot liquid boiling throughout the body. And the passage we've read constitutes a literal description of how anger works. Let us now turn to Seneca. Tellingly, the only context in which the Latin philosopher uses this metaphor chimes in perfectly with the Lucretian passage above. In the Ira 2:19, Seneca is describing the Stoic view of emotions, which are again seen as determined by movements of elements within the soul. So much like in the Epicurean approach, differences in mood and temperament are explained in terms of their variable mingling. I'm quoting Rigsby. So also within the Stoic perspective, a predominance of heat over the other elements will produce wrathful men in the form of boiling blood around the heart that renders the breast caldissimum. So I read the English text for the sake of brevity. Seneca writes, some of our school, that is Stoic thinkers, hold that anger is aroused in the breast by the boiling of the blood about the heart. Iram in pectore moveri effervescente circa cor sanguine. And as a result, in toto corpore caldissimum pectus est. The warmest part of the whole body is the breast. So, interestingly, the idea of the soul as materially composed of an admixture of elements derives from Hippocratic medicine, and the conception of anger as a warm boiling liquid enclosing the bodies was formulated in philosophy as early as by Aristotle. He clearly says that a physicist would define anger as a boiling of the blood or warm substance surrounding the heart. So basically he speaks of material conditions. The physicist thinks that there must be embodiment of it, that is, of this emotion, in a material. So, to conclude this short digression, the point of this discussion was to show that cultural models as well can influence emotion concept. So the embodied conceptualization of anger as a hot fluid in the body ultimately originated in Greek physiological doctrines and then entered Latin literature through the Epicurean and Stoic philosophy, which integrated aspects drawn from Greek physiology. So the metaphor was not a metaphor at all at the beginning. It emerged as a technical image within a specific literary genre. And a very interesting study by Gerertz and Gröndelers completes the story of this metaphor in Western thought. They show that the medieval physiological theory of the four humors, which is very coherent with the view of emotions held by Epicureanism and by Stoicism, corroborated the productivity of this metaphor from the Middle Ages to the modern era in the Western world, ultimately highlighting the possible role of cultural traditions as a source of emotion concepts. But a very important point here that cultural tradition as well can be based on embodied meaning. So this story illustrates another possible path along which metaphors can emerge in conceptualization and then in language, as culturally dependent literal expressions, again motivated, however, by the embodiment principle, to frame an abstract concept on the basis of a precise theoretical view. So to conclude, because I want to leave some space for the discussion, we have seen that embodiment is a key cognitive principle in structuring our understanding of the environment we inhabit, and that ancient people inhabited as well, because these cognitive operations worked along very similar lines in past societies, as I hope to have shown. Note, however, that embodied cognitive processes are not limited to metaphor and to semantics. This is an important point I would like to stress in the conclusions, because the embodiment mechanism has been proven to be pervasive and at work at different level of analysis and of sense making, including textual organization, syntactic structures, and pragmatic functions. And the books I have shown at the beginning of the presentation contain several studies on these different perspectives. So if you're interested, I can give you further data on this. So to conclude with a quote by Kovacs, says, metaphors are not necessarily based on bodily experience. They are often based on bodily experience, but they can also be based on cultural considerations. And conceptual metaphors can converge on and often produce cultural models that operate in thought. And these cultural models, as we have seen, they may be based on the embodiment principle too. And an important assumption which concludes this reasoning is that biology versus culture is a false antithesis, when the biological must be experienced and constructed, as Cairns wrote, in a cultural context, and when shared cultural categories draw on our nature as a physically embodied social species. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Federiani, for this fascinating talk. I myself have many questions, but as we have already started receiving questions in the Q&A box, I will now start promoting all the participants to the level of panelists so that they can more easily make their own questions. As we're doing that, though, let us read the first question by Dr. Maines. Which states, thank you very much for this interesting talk. I have two questions. regarding cultural motivations first. Do you see these metaphors as reflecting also religious practices, such as the divine personification of emotions? Love can be a living being with living behaviors because Amor Cupid is a divine persona. And secondly, how do you address mixed metaphors when Sappho, Fragment 31, and Catullus 51 portray love as a flame? It is also a living thing that creeps and an opponent to be resisted or tolerated.
Okay. Should I stop sharing the screen, or what do you think?
Actually, that would probably be for
Okay.
the best. We can
so
put it
maybe I can see you again. I don't know. Perhaps it could be very nice. Okay. Thank you so much for these interesting and very important questions. Well, first one is about religion, the impact of religion and personification. Yes, we have found many instances, an amount of instances. I don't have here exact numbers of personifications in the sense of emotion written with capital letters, let's say, and therefore embedded in allegorical, so to speak, contexts as well. And of course, given the given the fact that gods were personified, basically, this has probably influenced the view of emotions as living beings, for sure. And we have many examples where this is the case. I think that religion thinking has probably influenced metaphorically the structuring of emotions in a more abstract way as well. Now we are currently studying late Latin data, and we are seeing that the vertical orientation axis becomes more and more relevant with the beginning of the Christian era. So in our view, the Christian conception of a God who is above us, and yes, basically in heaven, and the opposition between heaven and the earth, let's say, and people living on the earth, probably enhanced the importance of the vertical axis, because we are seeing it in our data. So yes, religion has a very clear impact on that. And on mixed metaphors, well, of course, there are a lot of complex metaphors relying on different mappings simultaneously and instantiating different images in one and the same sentence, context, verse, and so on. From a procedural perspective, we have counted them twice or 3 times, and it is absolutely true that images can fruitfully interact, both in poetry, but not also in poetry, in prose as well. So yes, this is absolutely true. And now I don't remember the Sappho verse, but this is very interesting, and we are taking this into account in our research.
All right. Are there any other questions? I have a list of them myself, but maybe I can ask. I can start with one that shouldn't take too long, but I think it might be an interesting point for reflection. When you were showing the examples of love being blind, I was of course, we noticed we saw this as being basically mostly an attribute. So love is this blind creature, but there's but it is. I found it fascinating because, of course, there's also the extension of that, in that from attribute we often see in Latin, but also in other cultures. The shift from attributive quality to causative. So love is blind and makes. someone blind. So I was wondering if there are any more examples of a similar shift from attributive connotation to causative, and the compresence of the same quality for other emotions as well. So for example, if anger is something that is blind and blinds you, so not necessarily with the blinding metaphor, but with the blindness metaphor. But so if how do you, for example, conceptualize theoretically the cognitive process by which a quality is turned into a causative function?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and with Irene De Felice, who is here, and if she likes to take the floor, I mean, feel free, Irene, to take the floor if you want to, if you like to add something, because she has studied the blind metaphor in detail, and this is a very interesting issue. I mean, the point is that this is a mapping between two concepts. The concept of blindness, for example, and the concept of love. And this mapping can take different forms. I mean, the emotion can cause visual impairment or being personified as a blind creature. And note also that this, by the way, that the attributive quality of blindness is not present in visual arts, and it's much later. So in both Greek and Latin art, the idea of Cupido blinded, let's say Amor as blinded person, is not present. So probably this is a visual metaphors which comes after the conceptualization we find in Latin literature. By the way, this is a very important thing. From a theoretical perspective, I don't know, we have to think about it, but in my view, this is a piece of evidence of how the mapping between concepts can take different forms and can be productive at different levels. And other examples of this type are are found within the disease conceptual domain. So for example, an emotion which is a disease and can cause a disease in the experiencer, and including mental disease, that is madness. So an emotion can be mad and can make a person mad. And within this set of, attributive of qualities, psychological or bodily qualities, this is a very interesting parallel, so to speak. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your answer. And of course, this opens up to even more question, because it's such a fascinatingly productive approach. It also links into how, given that one emotion causes a certain reaction, there's also the notion that it has a control over a state of opposition. So this is, for example, if an emotion is able to cause a disease, then it means that it is able to control it and thus to take away that same disease. But let me not.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah,
I mean, there are more possibilities than the ones I have discussed here. For the sake of simplicity, let's say, I have chosen very relevant mappings, but there are more kinds of association between concepts. Yes.
Yes. Professor Tui has doubtlessly something to say. Well, quite a lot to say, I expect.
Just so two questions I wanted to ask you about. The first one is what do you do with secondary emotions? I know one of your postdocs worked on envy, but that's what I mean by this is that I can see it with love, with fear, and so on. But what do you do with something like surprise, which is a primary emotion, or guilt? Guilt's such a good one that you can't paint guilt. you can possibly paint surprise, which might offer an answer, but or gratitude. How do you deal with gratitude? Embarrassment. You can paint embarrassment, I guess, but the secondary emotions and some primary ones get really hard. So I don't mean this as a criticism, just asking you, have you thought beyond the things like anger and so on?
Thank you very much for this interesting and question, and I mean a very right one, if I may say. Well, unfortunately, this project is a 2-year project, and the crew, let's say the research group, is so small. This is a very small project, and therefore we decided to begin with primary metaphors, basic emotion terms, and to circumscribe our research to nouns only, for example. We are not considering verbs or adjectives or other cognate terms, for example. So this is just a choice because only for these emotions I've mentioned, we had looked at more than 12,000 contexts. And this takes a lot of time. But you're absolutely right. So I hope we could extend our research project in the future. Some students, for example, are working in their dissertation on happiness and sadness, for example. And hopefully in the future, we will be able to continue this investigation and to include the interesting emotions and feelings you mentioned. Yeah. And we would also like to include bodily feelings, such as, for example, illness and hunger, cold, hot, and other, bodily experiences as well. Because if you think, if you think at modern languages, they are often expressed metaphorically. And so this could be very interesting. And this is a very understudied area in Latin semantics. So there's a lot of work to do, for sure. And it would be very nice to extend our research to secondary metaphors as well, also to detect possible emotion-specific mappings. So some emotion-specific mappings have emerged in our research, for example, with regard to love and hate. We have found that these emotions can be sometimes seen as the sea, or the animal emotion as well is circumscribed to anger mostly. But the more emotions you compare and investigate, the more individual metaphorical patterns you can discover, and they can tell you a lot about how a specific experience was conceptualized. Other are more general. For example, emotions are opponents, locations, objects. They are much more general and shared across emotions. And we'll see in the future, I hope, whether secondary metaphors behave in the same way. Who knows?
The other one I wanted to ask, and what you said seems perfectly reasonable to me. It's dreadfully hard to work on something like surprise. I mean, maybe it's a vertical thing. You jump with surprise and so on. But animals, I thought I'd mention, or non-human experiences of emotion. I know this is a linguistic project, but animals seem to experience all the emotions we're looking at. And I say this not just trying to be sympathetic to animals or trees, if it's Pliny the Elder or something like that. But you can't use, what do you do when you're trying to identify an emotion, which is, of course, not what you're trying to do, but if you're trying to identify it in an animal or a palm tree or ivy or something like that. It's people like me would say you look for phenotypes, you look for sort of cliched visual things. And they're not cliches because they're real things that live animals can express, or that plenty might turn into a cliche. Is there any, have you got any thoughts then on how this would impact on non-human species?
This is a very big question for me, a historical linguist, because the point is that when dealing with ancient languages, things get even more complicated, because of course our pieces of evidence about feelings of animals is even more difficult to grasp. I have to say that we haven't thought about the animal domain. I was talking about, I mean, we found metaphors where emotions behave like animals, for example. There are very clear and interesting instances, and this is specifically the case of anger. So we have seen, and this is very interesting as well, that happiness sometimes is conceptualized as an animal who flies, a bird typically, and this is very interesting as well because birds pertain, so to speak, to the sky. So again, this vertical orientation comes up again with the idea of happy is up. So happiness correlates with the animals who go up in the sky, to the sky. But that's all. I mean, our reflection about the emotional system of animals is circumscribed to the role that animals play as a source concept for emotion concepts. But we'll think about it. Thank you very much for this interesting suggestion.
Just one last thing on that. If you're looking at phenotypes, that is to say, the way that an emotional state typically demonstrates itself, that in something like envy, which you had somebody working on, that envy, like jealousy, always works in threes. It's the definition, almost the most basic constituent of it. I mean, if there's not threes, you know, two people and a thing, it's not going to work. But it enables you to see things like this, or moving a linguistic concept that you might have with humans to animals. That, you know, if you're dealing with affection with animals, just to make it easier, I mean, there's phenotypical behavior that ethologists and people like that who are interested in these things can talk about. But I just mentioned envy because you spoke of that one, and there you can get a sort of visual link between what humans are doing, find the language that they're using, and then the visual link to animals. I mean, you're not going to have jealousy in animals if there's not three of them, for example, or at least a third element with two animals.
Yes, that's true.
The last thing I'd say, a lot of people would say, well, do animals experience human emotions? And I think with that one, you've got to say yes, because emotions exist, and this metaphorical language you're speaking of as a reflection of that, as evolutionary leg ups as they were, they're adaptive things, that it's not just human beings that use anger to protect themselves in the way you were speaking of earlier. Animals do it too. And I don't think there's an emotion that isn't shared by animals once you work into it. That's getting a little bit far from it, but I was just trying to link it back to the envy business you're mentioning. Sorry, I'm speaking too much, but anyhow.
No.
Yeah.
These are all very interesting suggestions, and I think we will try to, deepen this point to see how ethologist research can give us hints or further ideas to look at emotions. We've read some psychological studies on anger, of course, and envy, without considering animals, however. So this could be another, to get to the basics of the emotion, animals can be useful. Yes, I agree. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, it's always, it's also, of course, the point of moving on. we're moving on from linguistics through semantics to cultural worldviews, basically. So if anything, or rather, in addition to that, not just ethology, we have to consider historical cultural ethology. So how those ancient societies themselves conceptualized animals as, in terms of what human characteristics did they project into animals to better understand them. And this is, of course, something that is culturally specific, or it starts out that way. It may turn out that it is actually, for example, shared between broader linguistic groups, like the Indo-European way of portraying an enemy as the snake, or those types of things. And this brings me to a final question, unless other I believe Amber raised her hand at the beginning if she had a question. I don't want to monopolize the question board. In any case, I'll just ask this brief point, which again is more of a general question on, in general, how do you deal in your handling of the corpus with, for example, literary models, or even the trickling down of seemingly intellectual cultural constructs, in terms of them being accessible or even widespread notions. For example, when you talked about the metaphor of love being a chain, being vinculus, of course, there's tons of literary models, and I'm sure that a good chunk of your metaphors for that came from elegiac poets.
Yes, sure.
So how do you relate that to popular culture? I mean, of course, given that you're examining a corpus that is so massive in terms of scope and time, of course, you're contrasting the data of frequency of certain themes in literary genres with frequency outside those literary genres. And so operationally, how do you do that? And also when you were talking about Aristotelian physiology, of course, people who would read Aristotle would be able, or listen to him speaking, would be able to understand those concepts. So at the same time as Hippocratic medicine or Aristotle are dealing with these topics, they are not operating as complete innovators, in that what they relate is to be understood by their contemporaries. So they have to have something to latch onto. So this might be a basic observation, possibly too simplistic, but that is to say that possibly the spread of into popular culture of such concepts might be more than what we are led to think if we just confine ourselves to literary attestation. So I wonder how you gauge with how you operate with those two with those two assumptions and problems, really.
Yeah, this is very fundamental questions again. So thank you, Gabriele. Well, as you said, we are dealing with a huge amount of data. So and we are. This is still an ongoing process. So at the moment, we are trying to figure out what are the main tendencies of conceptualization and give an account of them, basically. But with some emotion-specific metaphors, or metaphors which are not documented so pervasively, for example, 800 times, we are trying to trace paths of development, of circulation, of spread, of literary echoing or calquing of models between authors and texts. So, for example, the chain metaphor is documented 29 times in Latin literature. It is very widespread. So this metaphor was probably conceptual in the sense, in the Lakovian sense. So it probably belonged to the figurative structure of Latin speakers. But there are metaphors which are much more genre dependent. For example, Roberta Leotta, the PhD student who is working with us from the University of Edinburgh, she's studying jealousy in ancient Rome with a very specific approach which integrates literary studies and linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and she has discovered that the metaphor jealousy is a bite, is the action of biting someone, is found specifically in elegiac poetry. And this relates to a very specific and cultural view of the love triangle, where the bite of love played a significant role. So this is a case where metaphor is bound to a given textual tradition, and where a model can be replicated by different authors belonging to the same genre, for example. Or when we notice it that the anger is a hot fluid metaphor is so rare, we try to understand why, and we reconstructed the story I've told. So yes, we are trying to deepen the literary side now that we have completed our data analysis. And this, if I may add this final thing, is the most interesting aspect, that of integrating, quantitative tendencies and what emerges from a very big amount of data with data-specific observations, which traces us back to the text and the context and the author and so on. Yes.
Thank you very much for this answer. I suppose it was. These are themes that we could go on talking about for hours, really. Are there any more questions? If we've already taken up so much of everyone's time, and especially of our speaker's time, and we really want to thank her for being with us today, for agreeing to share the fascinating results and ongoing developments of this fascinating project. And it is also our pleasure to invite you to follow Craig's activities, the Classic Religious
Thank you so much. I will.
Archaeology Interdisciplinary Group. We're going to have other events lined up, and but overall, we hope we can get another chance, maybe in the future, to observe the later stages of the development, the future developments of this fascinating project. So I thank you all for participating, and you are now free to leave the room. Thank you.
But please let me thank you, Gabriele, for chairing this session, this seminar. And again, to the whole group for this wonderful invitation and welcome. And
to Elisa, of course, who was a member of our interdisciplinary group, actually first suggested we'd invite you. And it was a suggestion we were absolutely very happy to take. And thank you all for joining.
Have a nice day, since it's morning in Calgary, so.
Oh yes, yeah. I had to shut down the blinders of my window. Too much light's coming in, and.
Wow. Okay. So have a nice day, and hopefully we'll meet again in the future, perhaps in Canada.
Oh yeah, well, hopefully we'd be very happy to show you around. Perhaps not in February, as it's been quite cold the past days. We've had low peaks of -40, and it's now much better. It's now just -5, so it's really it's really improved. And of course, thank you to Irene and Roberta for joining us today. And yes, I just
Thank you very much.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just
you can meet a part of the team.
Yeah. And yes, let's see, there's just lots of thank you messages. Yeah, the thing that's been missing from these events, of course, is the warmth of applause and celebratory bottles to be opened. And
I can imagine that. Thanks. No problem.
Yeah, but in general, since Akash is also a member of our group, so we can now that the public has basically the broader public has left, I just wanted to thank you once more, and do let me know when the payment is coming
Okay,
through.
yes, I will.
It should have
Thank
been
you.
already processed by on Sean's end. These international wire transfers can take quite some time to
No problem at all.
process, but it's coming. It should be coming soon. In any case,
okay.
we'd be more than happy to keep in touch. And I remember, Elisa, was when we last met in 2019 in October in Copenhagen. You were telling me about the metaphor specifically. Well, when we last met in person, really, we've been kind of hearing from each other on an almost daily basis. But last time you were telling me, what specifically did you work on in her class?
I think 2019 I didn't even know about metaphor and all of this, because the course I took was in 2020. So maybe you were talking about.
Oh yes, the metaphor. Yeah.
Maybe you're thinking about spatial conceptualization of time. Yes.
No, I'm sorry. I might be mixing things up.
Yeah, I just read something for the Homeric seminar in Milan. It is the long story of time behind the back, and a future behind the back, and future in front. Well, is a bit confused. I just read some tiny bit of the whole literature that is present. It was a Homeric formula, grosso caio piso.
Yeah, highly
something in Pinder, actually.
A highly embodied way of expressing, conceptualizing time.
Yeah. Well, also Lakoff and Johnson speak about it. So, yeah. Well,
again, thank you all for joining, and
thank you all for listening.
I hope we can keep in touch in the near future. And once again, I bid you a nice evening and a good rest of the week. And best of luck with the future developments of your project.
We'll keep you informed, both Elisa and Gabriele. So we are also organizing a project workshop in Italian. So you're perfectly able to follow it in April with an invited guest who is an anthropologist of the ancient world, Donatella Puliga from the University of Siena. Okay, because Roberta knows her very well, so she put us in contact, and we are organizing a webinar basically. So if you'd like to join, we'll be presenting some ongoing research, and I mean it will be a very informal afternoon.
Sure.
So Elisa and Gabriele, I mean, I have your contacts, and this could be another opportunity to share ideas and, I mean, be in touch.
Yeah, no, of course, absolutely. It would be fascinating. I know.
Okay, so I'll give you, I mean, the program when it's there. We are just thinking about it now. well, we will organize it after Easter holidays, probably.
It's all
Okay.
right. Yeah, there's still plenty of time.
Okay.
Well, again, so thank you and bye.
Bye. Bye. So we'll keep in touch. Have a nice day or evening.
Bye.
Bye.